high. It's estimated that 1 in 4 pregnancies in the UK end in loss during pregnancy or at birth. And the way an employer responds can have a huge impact on how someone copes, as well as their longer term views on the employer themselves. And miscarriage and child loss are deeply, deeply personal and profoundly challenging experiences that can significantly impact an individual. For many employees, navigating this most difficult of events and times while continue to fulfill their professional responsibilities at work can be really overwhelming. And it's really important for responsible employers to create a supportive workplace environment that acknowledges the emotional toll of miscarriage and child loss and offers compassion and understanding to affected employees. Now, we ran a session for CIPD Central London with my co-chair, Crystal, and we invited 2 brilliant experts in to share their experiences and their insights and research as well. And we're absolutely delighted that we didn't want it so only the people could actually attend could get the insights. So Katy, who is one of our experts that joined us, has really kindly offered to come back and sit down with me just to go through some of the questions that we asked and just to describe in a bit more detail, because we really want to make sure that HR professionals and managers actually feel resourced when it comes to dealing with this, because if it is 1 in 4 pregnancies, there's a very high probability that someone in your team or someone that you know will be affected by it, if it's not yourself as well. So thank you so much, Katy, for joining us. And thank you for agreeing just to share your insights. And I guess just for people that are joining us today, what brings you to study this? Because you're actually studying for a PhD in this. You run MIST workshops, which actually goes out and tries to educate and inform and really prepare managers and organizations for this situation. What brings you into this particular field?
Yeah, sure. So to be honest with you, for years, I couldn't actually answer this question without feeling quite, emotional about it. Because sadly, I do come to this topic because of my, own lived experience. But I'm so honored that I can now use that experience to help others. So, the PhD looks at workplace experiences of miscarriage. And it's actually expanded since then, actually. So I also look at childlessness as well and infertility. But yeah, it's led to the kind of practical side of this as well, so actually taking this into workplaces, making a difference. So, actually using my experience to make changes is something I never thought I would ever have the confidence to do, because I feel that the topic is just so taboo, even within your immediate friendship circles and even sometimes within families, So to actually be able to speak about it to managers, HR, the whole organization, it's not something I expected to be able to do, but here I am. So yeah, that's where it stems from.
Thank you. So we ran the session and we had brilliant questions from the audience, and it's like you sort of said, it is one of the final taboos in the workplace for people to talk about. And it is really important that we sort of create an environment where people can actually sort of share. But I think it's also important to understand the impact that this can have. So from your perspective, what are some of the emotional and psychological challenges that employees may face after experience a loss related to pregnancy or child loss? And how can HR professionals recognize and acknowledge the impact in the workplace of this?
Yeah, sure. So it's one of those life events that is shrouded in taboo, sadly. And that means that often people are not receiving the support that they need. So the taboo reinforces the silencing, which sadly exacerbates the emotional effects, I would say. So what we know is that pregnancy loss is a unique experience. So, it does affect people differently. And what that means is we need to be aware of that at work, because there's not a one size fits all, if you like. So some of the common emotional effects, I would say, definitely a bereavement, and that bereavement being disenfranchised. So, something that's not publicly accepted or socially recognized. So, people are mourning in silence. I'd say as well, the link with mental health illness is really key to note here. So specifically anxiety, depression, and more recently post-traumatic stress disorder, which, you know, we often associate with people in combat, you know, but the effects can be so significant, and, you know, we're actually seeing life-changing reactions to this type of loss. And then because we don't have the support in place, these effects are, you know, long lasting. So yeah, I mean, I've come across people who have had post-traumatic stress so severely, it's been very debilitating for them that, you know, for example, one lady, she had to actually change the bathroom suite in her home because that's where she'd experienced her loss. So going in there, you know, could trigger her going into panic and having flashbacks and, you know, reliving that experience again. So, you know, this is the level we're talking about. And I think it's just so minimized, not just in work, but by society. So many people experience as well self-blame and a sense of failure. And that really stems from the lack of answers. You know, most people are not tested to see why this has happened. And even if they do receive testing, which is usually after 3 losses as well, it's quite barbaric. You know, you often don't get any explanation anyway. So I think what this does is it forces people to look for reasons, and then they self-blame. And again, that, you know, really exacerbates the psychological impact of this. I think it's key to also recognize partners, because they are sadly overlooked, you know, but the research indicates, we don't have a lot of research, but what we do know from the sparse amount is that most male partners do experience this as a significant grief. It's linked with depression, and regardless of gender, you know, there is a link with suicidal thoughts as well, which I think is a real taboo with men anyway, and depression, you know, being a taboo with men as well. So yeah, it's sadly, it is, you know, very significant for many people, but I think it's also important to recognize that for others, they may experience it as a bit of a blip in their reproductive journey. So, you know, they want to move forward quite quickly. And sometimes people don't necessarily see it as the loss of a baby. And I think, again, that can be to do with, you know, trying to come to terms with it and move forward, to be able to try again, or, you know, so yeah, it's complex and it is unique.
And
Yeah.
it's also, it's quite physical as well, isn't it? It's not just the emotional impact, but actually can sort of have quite sort of lasting effects for people, can't it?
Definitely. And I think the physical effects are very much taboo, you know, because anything that involves talking about, you know, women's embodied experiences is really still quite, yeah, it's kept kind of behind closed doors. You know, even within healthcare settings, the physical symptoms are not always spoken about. So many people are sent home without any explanation as to what they're going to go through. There's no leaflet even, you know. And even if you look on the NHS website, the symptoms are listed quite in a way that's, I don't know how to describe it really, but maybe minimizing and quite cold and formal. And perhaps even minimizing the experience of, you know, what people may expect to go through. So yeah, often people say to me, you know, I've interviewed many people now, and they'll say they were very shocked by what they actually went through. And, you know, some people have surgery, some people need medication to speed up the process. Some people have to have repeated surgery, you know, because the first fails. And yeah, many managers that I speak to who haven't had firsthand experience of this, they'll say, my goodness, I had no idea. I had no idea just how significant the physical effects and psychological effects are.
And it's so important. Like, obviously, we're focused on this because I think first we need to understand and define what it is before we can actually start to solutionize and what we can do as well. And because obviously with things like this, these aren't quick fixes. Like, time can, to a certain extent, help people feel better, but it never goes away, does it? But sometimes the support in place by organisations, either through like statutory, isn't necessarily enough, is it?
Definitely. And I think it's important to note about the cutoff point. You know, so if you do have a loss after 24 weeks gestation, that's considered a stillbirth. And that actually allows employees to have, full access to maternity leave and pay, and, for partners, paternity leave, or, parental leave for a more inclusive term. But losses before this point, there aren't legal protections. You don't have the same entitlement, but it's quite a stark injustice, really, when you think about it, because your level of grief is not going to be any different, if you have a loss before that cutoff point. So I guess it's key for organizations to be aware of, actually, you do still have some kind of protection. It's just that it's not really clearly contained in a policy, although, forward-thinking organizations are putting this into a formal policy. But if you do have a loss before 24 weeks, i.e. a miscarriage, you are protected because you have what we call pregnancy-related sickness, and that can't be used against you. But sadly, many employers who I, work with, they've never heard of it. Even HR managers have not heard of this. And, they're recording sickness under general absence, which of course can flag attendance management processes and, warnings, disciplinaries even. So, yeah, I think that's really key, that although they don't have the same rights as someone who's experienced stillbirth, there are still protections in place.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when people do come back after it, like with other things, there's often reasonable adjustments they're made, so changes in workload and that as well. Whereas, like with often this, there's an expectancy just to keep going and just to come back and still be productive as well. And obviously, with the feelings of grief, and the brain can't detach, what type of grief it is. It feels grief, doesn't it? So people then have to keep going and functioning through the most difficult of times.
Definitely, because often there's no policy. So that makes people feel that, okay, I'm quite alone in this. This has only happened to me. They don't realize the commonality, they maybe think everyone else is just coping with this. So yeah, actually many people don't take any leave. They just carry on. And we know that that can be restorative for some people, a distraction, but actually the effects can then come later, this delayed grief. And that's really common in partners, actually. Holding it all together, continuing to go to work, and then actually come crumbling down, months later, because they just haven't allowed themselves to grieve.
Yeah, it's not something I've ever sort of spoken openly about, but look, we went through it a number of times, and it is the grief process is huge, isn't it? Like, I remember, like, the sense of really raw grief lasts for like a year. And it's a difficult time, and you can't talk about it, and people feel they don't understand what's going on because you don't necessarily want to share it with them as well. So it is that sort of feeling of isolation during that time, isn't there?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your own experience, and I'm so sorry for what you've been through. And I don't know if you feel similar to me, but it feels like such a big deal to talk about it in the professional sphere.
Yeah.
Because it almost feels like this is private, this is something we deal with at home, it's not welcome at work. And I think that's reinforced really by the lack of policy, the lack of training, the lack of people just talking about it in everyday conversations. But also in work, I don't know if you experienced this, but when people ask you, when are you having kids, or the expectation that you already do have them, I think those triggers, people don't realize that they're triggers, do they? Because it's seen as everyday chit chat and a nice positive thing to ask.
Yep.
But when you look at the stats, 1 in 4, but also 1 in 6 going through fertility struggles, 1 in 5 childless. You think, okay, we really need to help workplaces to see that these questions that might be well-intentioned, they're like a dagger to the heart. If you're struggling, or you're going through a current loss, as you have sadly experienced yourself, it's so hard.
You're trying to you understand why people say it, but it's and so therefore you have, you engage in the conversation anyway, don't you? Because you don't necessarily want to talk about it, but it just feels just there. And often people are not so good around grief anyway, and if they did understand, they'd often ask the wrong question, or sort of minimize it. Is that something that you sort of see in like from the research that you've conducted, how people are when it comes to dealing with grief?
Yeah, because I think that this isn't even recognized as the legitimate grief, if that makes sense, because, so many of the discourses around it are, okay, it wasn't even a baby yet, it was too early, you hadn't got attached, you didn't get to know this child as such. So because of that, I think people feel, okay, I can't really grieve because, society doesn't let me. There's no funeral, apart from for much later losses. So yeah, I think that really adds to the whole experience of grief, that it's not seen as legitimate, it is minimized. There's nothing to physically mourn often. So you kind of feel a bit, okay, was it real? All I've got is this pregnancy test stick that's now, it's faded. It doesn't even say pregnant anymore. Maybe you might have bought something for the baby, but maybe you didn't. So it's really hard. And some of the comments that, people receive are often, again, well-intentioned, but they're very minimizing, at least you went further along. At least, you can get pregnant, but what use is that if you're going through your current loss? It's
100%. Yeah.
Anything that starts with at least really is, I think it comes from a place of human nature trying to make you feel better. I really do think that. But I also think it comes from a place of this lack of training. So, we provide communication training organization wide. So people are equipped with the tools to know what to say, and they're confident to know, okay, I mustn't minimize. But yeah, one of the things that I recommend is to really mirror how the person discusses their loss. So if they say the term pregnancy or fetus, go with that. If they use the term baby, which is quite common, regardless of, how early the pregnancy was, go with that, and recognize that there's likely a very significant attachment. But yeah,
and this can make all the difference, can't it? Because it can trigger people quite significantly, can't it? And I think that's sort of, so we've kind of, it is really difficult. And I guess that's thinking about what is it that HR leaders, managers and organizations can do to create that kind of supportive and compassionate workplace culture for employees who've actually experienced baby loss at different stages in that process.
Yeah, sure. And there are so many things that they can do. Some of them are more, formal initiatives like the policy, which I recommend to have a separate policy on pregnancy loss, because actually what we find is many people feel triggered, trawling through the maternity policy. That's not a nice thing to have to do when you've gone through a loss. So having a separate policy and having, a flexible, inclusive policy that recognizes, loss because of surrogacy, partners going through loss, even so some of the more innovative and, amazing policies that I've seen have included grandparents or, family members who might be affected by this as well. And I think that's amazing. But also giving more than that bare minimum in terms of leave, specifying, that the leave can be taken flexibly. So, later on in case of delayed grief, things like phased returns, working from home, flexible working, all the things that you would give in other situations of grief or sickness, have those on the table, have them ready to offer to someone who likely feels very scrambled in their thoughts. Even having a shower and getting ready for work can be really daunting when you're going through this, so to have someone kind of spell it out in policy, but then also, to go through that with you, thinking of line managers.
I'm just going to close my mind because there's an unusual yellow thing up in the sky that's pointing down. So I'm just going to.
Oh, not the sun.
Okay. Yeah, and it's not necessarily because it's the right thing to do, but often if you can support your employees during a time like this, then the dividend that you reap is often huge loyalty, isn't it? Because they can actually understand this is a really compassionate environment, and there's then a reciprocity, isn't it? People really appreciate the place that they work, the the sort of discretion that's given to them. And it's not that people are trying to, exploit the situation. It's just understanding that seeing you as a human being and being flexible can make all the difference at this time, can't it?
100%, and some of the things that organizations can offer that, and not so formal. So obviously we've spoken about policy, we've spoken about training, but just things like recognizing Baby Loss Awareness Week, having a banner on your website, having a resource page with maybe links to charities, helplines. Those things are so simple, but they have a huge impact on people going through this. Setting up support groups. Actually, one organisation I've worked with, I really liked what they did during Baby Loss Awareness Week. They actually had like a virtual, it was a tree, and you could add messages, names, whatever you felt comfortable with. It could be anonymous. And they had that for anyone that had been through this, whether it was recently or, decades ago. And I just thought, how amazing is that to bring this conversation in, and that's what I would describe as an informal initiative that can just be life-changing for someone who's been holding this in, and it just makes the conversation welcome in the workplace.
And I think it's always that surprising. So when you do actually talk about it and say you have been through it, it surprises you how many people around you that you which all of a sudden say, I've been through that as well. It's quite an incredible phenomenon, isn't it, to watch?
It's really amazing because even, close friends, close colleagues, and then it makes you feel it's so upsetting that they actually went through that and they didn't tell you. So you can feel guilt that this conversation is only coming out now because you've been through it as well, so yeah, it's just so stigmatized. And this is what we're really trying to do at Mr. Workshops, stop this from being a taboo, and make sure that people are getting the support that they need, because with the prevalence and the significance, this shouldn't be something that's talked about in whispers.
Yeah, we've already seen the incredible progress that's happened with menopause.
Yeah.
5-10 years ago, it was unspoken about. And I've often sort of come across stories and had to work with people to support them to just voice, and get some adjustments made. And now it's part and parcel of many organizations' language, and there's so much understanding. So there's an opportunity here to really use things like, National Fertility Week and Baby Loss Month to give them a chance to really talk about it, isn't there?
Definitely. And yeah, I like to compare the pregnancy loss, infertility, and also childlessness topics that I help workplaces with to menopause, and to try and show workplaces that, look, this is something that needs to gain similar traction, because of the prevalence of it. But yeah, it's certainly something that I've seen really building momentum. And, Baby Loss Awareness Week, last month, I was just back to back with training sessions, and it was amazing, that workplaces are engaging, but we also want to make sure they're not just engaging with it because it's Baby Loss Awareness Week or Baby Loss Awareness Month. So what things can we do? So this is across the year, this is something that isn't just spoken about during those weeks.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that we're really consciously aware of is managers are increasingly having more responsibility put on them.
Yeah.
Many of them are sort of seen as first responders to mental health challenges in their team. Many managers are actually reluctant managers. I think there's a really scary statistic. I think 4 million reluctant managers in this country. So people that find themselves in management positions that either didn't necessarily want it or kind of leadership has found them. And often they're highly technical people. And all of a sudden they're invited into situations like this where they're having to talk about, areas that they may not feel comfortable, or they're just not sure what to say. Like, what do I say in this situation? What kind of things are available, like tips, tactics, training programs? What kind of things are available for managers to sort of help them navigate this difficulty for them?
Sure, yeah. Well, I definitely recommend having, specialist training on this, because it is a unique life event. So through Mr. Workshops, we offer training sessions, and We do management specific ones, we do HR specific ones, colleagues, and more recently, actually, mental health champions or mental health first aiders training. So yeah, I just recommend really that everybody receives this, because you don't know when you're going to get disclosure. You don't know who in your team is going through this. We know it's extremely common. So being aware of what to say is a big part of that training, communication training. But some of the things that I would say, and they sound really simple to be honest, but just saying, I'm sorry for your loss is so empowering to hear, for someone to validate what you've been through. So instead of this, oh, at least, or, trying to compare it to something worse is another thing that sadly sometimes people do. Yeah, just to really validate that and to just offer a listening ear and to ask, do you need time off work? Would you like to talk about this more? Those kind of things can be great in the initial kind of disclosure.
So giving people control and choices is important.
Absolutely, because, some people might want to carry on, they don't want to take a period of leave. But for some people, they need to be told, okay, you can take a period of leave if you need. Some people feel that they're letting their team down, or it might jeopardize their career in some way, because that's one of the reasons why people don't disclose. So some research that I've done with organizations, it was 72% of people didn't feel that they were able to turn to HR to talk about their pregnancy loss, which, when you think about HR being the center of an organization, I found that statistic particularly shocking. And actually, the one for line managers wasn't too far behind that. It was 64%.
What's the reason behind that?
I think one of the main reasons is that people feel that if they do disclose that they've had a loss, they're then disclosing that they are potentially going to take a period of parental leave. So they're alerting their employer to the fact that they're trying to conceive potentially, and then they're worried that, okay, how is this going to affect me at work? Promotions, being made permanent, will they take projects away? Because sadly, this is what I'm coming across in the research that I'm doing, and I have met people who have been given warnings for leaving their organization to seek care from their hospital, because they were bleeding in pregnancy. It's just shocking. Some people have been made redundant, given disciplinaries for taking leave. I've even come across non-disclosure agreements and legal cases, which I couldn't continue that interview with this particular person to protect her. But just the fact that she has gone through that, I think is very telling, and very stark of what she's experienced, the fact that she won this legal case against her company for this. It's just shocking.
Wow. And I guess you've done a lot of research in the area as well. Are you able to sort of share some of the findings of the research that you've done so far?
Yeah, sure. So most of the time people are concealing that they've even been through this. As you're aware, that taboo is really very pervasive. This leads to people not taking adequate amounts of time off to recover, physically or psychologically. Mostly the support that is given is inconsistent, within an organization, because there isn't a policy. So there isn't this kind of standardized practice. But most people are talking, inconsistent or no support at all. Minimization in terms of how people react, that's really key. Discriminatory practice, as I mentioned, the leave being recorded under general sickness, for example, because people are unaware that this is a protected, it's a protected, so pregnancy-related leave. Other people were saying about, so partners being in a supporter role, and often people at work saying, how's your partner doing? Rather than asking them, so kind of bypassing that they could have had any kind of grief themselves. And just people feeling that the issue really needs a policy, it needs training, There have been some positive experiences, I should say. So sadly, those are often based on just very empathetic line managers. Sometimes they have first-hand experience themselves, but sometimes they don't, which I found quite interesting, actually, because, you know, if they'd been through it themselves and then they'd gone on to have children, it may be that they're not quite remembering, you know, how difficult it was, or it might just be that they recovered more quickly and they were able to come back to work quicker. So they put that expectation on, you know, the person in their team disclosing.
Oh, it's fascinating. And as you continue your research, are you happy to keep sharing the research with us so we can publicize it and really signpost people to it? Because I think, you know, HR is an evidence-based profession, and we need as much kind of a solid ground to make that a compelling case for people to make adjustments to the way in which people manage, and, you know, what the benefits are that they provide to their staff as well. And being highly practical, what can organizations do to their benefits packages to actually support their staff in a more proactive way?
Sure. So I definitely advise having a flexible policy in place, you know, pregnancy loss policy that actually states, you know, very clearly, very inclusively what is available for support, you know, including a generous period of leave, you know, recognizing that that leave should be flexible because of delayed grief. That leave should be for partners as well, or people who have lost because, you know, their surrogate has lost. Yeah, I think that the policies really need to be inclusive of, you know, other people affected within the family. So maybe grandparents, and other family members. And yeah, just making sure that the leave is beyond the minimum kind of recommendations from legislation, if that makes sense. So, you know, if you just give a matter of, you know, I don't know, like if you give 2 weeks, of course, that's really positive. But what that can then do is it can make people feel that they need to have recovered in the 2 weeks. So, you know, the most innovative workplaces I've had the pleasure to work with, you know, have offered longer periods than this, maybe 4 weeks. And then they've offered other types of leave that could be used in case they need more, which I think is really very positive. Offering return to works, you know, formal return to works, which, you know, are compassionate and sensitive and appropriately worded, I should say. Yeah, those are some things that workplaces could definitely do.
And does this extend to like employee assistance programs as well? You know, should they be able to sort of access therapy and counselling as required?
Yeah, 100%. And you could even include that within the policy, within the support documents that you have, you know, have a resource bank of where people can turn to. But yeah, that can be really empowering, because then the person going through this loss can feel, again, that validation that, okay, this is something that's worthy of counselling, you know, this is grief. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and when we took questions from the audience, actually, it became a point of difference. You know, if you want to attract, and there's this enormous talent pool of people that are, you know, critiquing your organization. Is this an organization that I want to work with? And some of the more progressive organizations are actually publishing their policies, aren't they, for others to see, so they can actually evaluate. Do you get it? You know, I don't necessarily feel safe enough to ask a question in the interview about whether you do, and that's down to the individual, the organization. But it's just, you can publicize these things, can't you?
Yeah, I think that's really great practice, you know, to not kind of keep this all to yourself and this is only something we offer, you know, because actually this is for the greater good. And companies such as Monzo, you know, goodness, I've worked with an NHS trust who's introduced policy training, and just recently, actually, Premier League Football Club, they've introduced an amazing policy, and I've done training with them. Some of the universities now, you know, they're recognizing this, so it's really amazing to see. But I think sharing resources and best practice is just, yeah, it's so positive, just for the greater good of all organizations, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that really stood out from at the time when we were going through it is there's with the policies sometimes a disparity and they don't look at it holistically. So my partner was studying at the time as well as working, and so she asked for extensions to the coursework. And then someone else that she knew was on the course actually asked for an extension because they were going through a house move, and the house move actually got more time off.
Goodness.
And again, it's that kind of it's unconscious, and they're both coming from good places. They want to support, but it kind of again it illustrates that lack of fairness or lack of sort of understanding of what the situation is, isn't it?
Definitely. That's really shocking. And yeah, I've come across a similar example. Someone was saying they received more time off when they had a chest infection and they actually received more sympathy than when they disclosed their miscarriage, you know. So I think having the policy there can really help because it really outlines, okay, this is a period of leave that you can take. And then obviously line managers can be flexible with that, you know, and HR, and you could think about it on a personal basis, you know, what does this person need? Do they need a bit more time? Because what I don't know if you've come across this in your own, you know, work that you do, but I certainly found with this topic, the more support you give, especially in terms of leave duration, actually the less time people take because they feel really well supported and it's there as a safety net if they need it.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's a really worthwhile piece of research as well, isn't it? Because often what drives these limitation in days is because they believe there's a small percentage that will exploit it to its maximum. Whereas really, if you treat people as adults, then they'll act like adults as well, won't they?
Definitely. And, you know, some of the smaller companies, I completely understand their fears of implementing a policy and giving leave because, you know, what are they going to do about cover? What are they going to do about the financial implications? But what I say to them is, you know, you can't afford not to do this because actually people will take more time in terms of leave later on often, you know, or demonstrating presenteeism, you know, so they're not really fit for work, they're not being very productive or engaged, but they're just still turning up because they feel they have to. So, you know, really the costs by not acknowledging this are far, you know, they're far worse than if you actually offer this period of leave for people going through pregnancy loss.
Yeah, and it's not a comparison, but again, it's a similar sort of example where progressive organisations offer their staff unlimited holiday, and it kind of
Yeah.
comes from the same orientation, doesn't it? And what they've often found is that they don't take the holiday. In fact, if anything, they don't take as much as they did before, which is a problem in itself. But again, it
Yeah.
just shows if we policy is often the scar tissue of previous mistakes, and so it's really understanding what's driving that as well. One of the things that we're really focused on, because obviously, you know, this came from CIPD Central London session, and it's almost like who cares for the carer. So HR people that might be sitting down with people, you know, going through a very emotional time, managers that are having to support their staff that might be really emotionally vulnerable. We can't help but project our emotions onto others. And so it's often like, if we're going to invite our managers into having these types of conversations or our HR people to provide even more support, it's important to have boundaries to make sure what they can support and what they can't. But how can they emotionally look after themselves so it doesn't come at too great a cost to them?
Yeah, such a great question because we know that it could be triggering, you know, if they've been through it or they're going through it themselves. So maybe they don't feel able to support someone else, you know. But what I would say is that it's important to have someone who you can turn to. So I call it almost an informal offload, you know, that you could have a designated person to turn to and it's clearly, you know, signposted. It's there and you know that you could turn to that person. It's also good to have someone who I'd say is outsourced. So this is something that we've actually started providing through Miss because people have asked us about it. You know, can you be our person to sort of give us advice on individual cases? But equally, in case somebody needs to just, you know, ask from their own personal perspective, you know, they're going through this as a manager, as an HR professional, and they're just struggling. you know. I'd say more of the struggles, though, and more of the triggers come from dealing with pregnancy announcements rather than disclosures of loss if they've gone through loss. So, if you work in HR and you're having to deal with someone's maternity leave, for example, that's often worse, because they have to be all, congratulations and engaging in those kind of conversations. It can be really hard. So if you can take that off somebody in the team because they're affected, that can be really empowering for them. And sometimes pregnancy announcements, they're not just affecting people in HR, they're sent around in emails, so this is one thing that we talk about actually as part of our training. So it's about managing those triggers. If you want to organize a baby shower for somebody at work, when you think of the prevalence of pregnancy loss, it's highly likely that there are people who they can't attend a baby shower. It's far too triggering for them. And then, of course, people going through fertility treatment or their child is not by choice. And then that increases the amount of people who are triggered by these things. So, yeah, it's about managing those. And it's something that I'd say workplaces really, they're unaware of because, they want to provide support for parents, which is important. But at the same time, they need to make sure that they're not, creating a very difficult work environment to be in.
There's so much to be aware of, isn't it? There's so much ceremony that goes around it. And I think sometimes we're unaware of what the triggers are, aren't they? Even the questions that we ask day to day might be triggering people around us. And it's not that the people that experience it want to stop it. It's, it's not that they want to sanitize and censor the workplace. It's just to be considerate, isn't it?
I think that's it. So, I recommend not banning any of these things because, actually sometimes people celebrating pregnancy news have been through losses, or they've been through infertility. So just as an example, so, having a baby shower, what you can do is you can just take that off-site, make it optional, don't question someone why they're not there, So yeah, it's really hard, but some of these things are more what I call parental privilege. So they can be very difficult, things like if you don't have children, being asked to do certain shifts, or doing more travel, taking on workload because someone's had to leave because their child is sick. You know what I mean? So it's actually being mindful that some of the practices can actually be unfair and even discriminatory, so not even just triggering, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. And where can we sort of signpost people to go? So I've listened to what you're saying today. I'm realizing there's a gap in my organization's provision of support and care, either for my managers, for my HR people, or even, my employees themselves. Where are some really good first steps for them to go?
Yeah, sure. So you could turn to charities such as the Miscarriage Association. They're amazing. SANS and Tommy's as well. So they're doing research into the areas and they provide, excellent accessible resources. And of course, if you do want to address this formally, you want advice about policy, you want to implement organization-wide training, I do offer this through Missed Workshops. So, I recommend that you have a look at our website and see some of the services we offer. Everything we do is tailored to, the individual organization. But yeah, I just recommend that everybody is aware of this as an issue because this isn't just affecting, a small minority. This is actually a prevalent issue and it is affecting people at work. And we want work to, be restorative for people, to be a positive place, where they can achieve and they can receive the support that they need. But sadly for this topic, it's very rare to come across positive stories, so we're trying to change that.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a really nice and it's a really compelling call to action for people and organizations as well. I just want to just say, like, for me, a heartfelt thank you. Thank you for being out there and doing what you're doing and providing support to people. I'm so delighted that this is happening now. It's a shame it didn't start 20 years ago, but we have to start where we start as well. But I just wish you the best of luck with all the things that you're doing to try and change and address this workplace stigma and taboo. So thank you so much, Katy. And if anybody wants to contact you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, sure. So you can look at our website, mistworkshops.com, and I'm also available on LinkedIn. So you can find me, Katy Schnitzler, and Miss Workshops Limited also has a page as well. And yeah, I really welcome, your comments. If I can help in any way, answer your queries, please do get in contact.
Fantastic. And if you're watching this on YouTube, all of Katy's and Miss Workshops details are in the show notes as well. So thank you so much for your time, Katy. Thanks for coming back. We've taken even more of your time. And I just hope that even if 1 or 2 people watching this video start to make a difference to their organizations, then it's all been worthwhile. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and for engaging in this topic. I'm absolutely delighted to speak about it today with you.
Thank you.